Minister for Racing, Tourism, Sport, Major Events, Coordination of Jobs, Precincts, Regions, COVID-19, Industry Support, Recovery, Trade and Business Precincts. Clearly a minister with a very low boredom threshold, because that's an awful lot of gigs. And we're just waiting for him to join us. No. There we are. Minister, good morning.
Good morning, Margy. How are you?
I'm extremely well. How are you?
As well as can be expected in the circumstances, Margy.
Fair enough. Okay, well, look, let's get into it.
Sure.
We've discussed this sort of in a larger sense previously about, the impact of the bushfires and now lockdown number 1, lockdown number 2 in Victoria. This almost creates a completely unique situation in Victoria, doesn't it? Because you're the only state that's actually had to wear that. So the rebuild and recovery is going to be that much more difficult. What do you see as the biggest challenges in this space, apart from getting back to a normal from a restrictions point of view?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest challenge, frankly, and we're seeing it around the world at the moment, the biggest challenge is to avoid another wave. And that's why the public health teams are taking a cautious approach on this wave. I mean, we see right now in Europe tens of thousands of cases per day, new lockdowns happening in places like Ireland and Wales, and I suspect it's only a matter of time in mainland Europe as well. And whether or not there's lockdowns, the visitor economy gets decimated by a rampant pandemic. I'm not sure there's too many people visiting the USA at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a number of different challenges. In Victoria, it's threefold. We've got to get Melburnians back into the regions. We've got to get interstate visitors back into Victoria. Even though our border's open, it's still obviously there's not a lot of interstate travel going on. And then ultimately we've got to get international visitation back. And that's going to be, I think, a longer-term issue given the amount of virus that's still circulating in other parts of the world. I'm not sure that we're going to see the borders thrown open anytime soon. There'll be probably the travel bubble with New Zealand is a good start. There might be some other jurisdictions where that kind of thing is possible, but widespread international visitation is still some way off. It's probably vaccine dependent. So those are the challenges. The other challenges, of course, is that there are businesses that have been in extreme stress and remain in extreme stress. We've been doing a huge amount to try and support businesses through this, but there's obviously a limit to the ability of government to replace lost trade. But there's been, funding packages, support for accommodation providers who've lost business as a consequence of lockdown, and a range of other things. And then we've got the opportunities that exist through budget, through marketing campaigns, through business events, major events. Major events, of course, are also a major issue for us because they've been such a huge driver of the tourism and visitor economy. And we've still got, understandably, significant limitations, for example, on the number of people that can gather in confined indoor spaces. So, if whether that's the theatres or the museums and things of that nature, they remain limited. So there's a lot of challenges, and the state budget will be just one part of the solution to that.
Mm. So, knowing that this is going to be a long-term recovery process, anybody who's been realistic understands that. Victoria has always had the reputation as being the most cosmopolitan, great restaurants, great shopping, all of those kinds of things. This is going to be a bit of a brand rebuild, isn't it? I mean, I've been talking to retailers who say that for many of them, their CBD recovery could take a decade. So what does that mean for a longer-term Victorian brand and a Melbourne brand?
Well, look, I'm not a branding expert, but I know Visit Victoria has been working very closely on branding, and they'll be rolling campaigns out in the near future. It's obviously difficult to roll out advertising campaigns encouraging people to move around and start to do things which they're prohibited from doing under health restrictions. So we'll wait until it's the right time for that. The CBD obviously has some unique challenges, which is why we've created support funds specifically for the CBD. And that's because, you know, with the restrictions on office work, even when restaurants, pubs, galleries and bars are reopened, if people are not back at work in the CBD, if you've got a huge number of people working from home, the amount of foot traffic in the CBD will just be naturally reduced. But I think that the cosmopolitan nature of our city, the culture of our community, the network of laneways and bars, none of that will change. None of that will go away. That will still be there. And we have to gradually, you know, encourage people back into town. And yes, there's a branding rebuild. I'll leave the details of a branding rebuild to people who've got some expertise in marketing.
Okay, so just talking about major events, and obviously, you know, announcement just recently in terms of the Melbourne Cup and so forth. We've got the Australian Open. You know, where's your headspace in terms of when you think those major events are going to become a close to reality of normal again, or are we always going to face a hybrid version of it from this point onward, you know, until we've got a vaccine?
Yeah, look, I suppose it depends on the definition of always. I think that there will be a time when either vaccines or treatment are such that, you know, life can return to, you know, pre-COVID normal, but none of us know when that will be. I think what we've seen in terms of big international sporting events around the world. I mean, the World Series is on at the moment, limited crowds. The Kentucky Derby was run with no crowds. The US Open was conducted with no crowds. I think the French Open with some. So we're seeing all over the world some limitations on the sort of the way that events are conducted. I've got no doubt in my mind that the Boxing Day Test, the Australian Open, the Formula One Grand Prix will continue. They'll run this year and they'll run in Melbourne, but they'll look different. How different? We're still in conversations with those organising bodies, whether it's Cricket Australia or Tennis Australia or the AGPC about just how different. You know, there is still a huge, you know, there is still a point in holding these events. They are still wonderful TV events. I mean, the Cox Plate was on the weekend. It was a wonderful TV event. Melbourne Cup, will still wait and see whether there's some connections on course. But, you know, the reality is, if you see some of the big events around the world where they didn't adapt, so the Cheltenham Races Festival in England earlier this year, where people were cheek by jowl and it became a COVID super spreader event, we can't afford that.
No, absolutely. Look, I mean, I think from the tourism industry's perspective, we've always been 110% behind the issues being health related. Just in terms of major events, but taking it a slightly different direction, business events, because I think it has another level of complexity around it, the business event piece. Because so many of these major corporates are now making decisions about not letting people travel for business events, even if that was feasible and possible at this point in time. The business event industry is going to take, I think, a different kind of support and for a much more sustained level. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And I know there's a budget coming up, et cetera, but I'm just curious about your thoughts around business events, because I think it's a bit of a sleeper, this one. It's going to have a bigger impact than people realise.
Yeah, I think it will, and I think that will for a couple of reasons. One is because, you know, those big international business events where thousands of people travel from around the world, I think they're probably, you know, they might happen at some point in 2021, but I wouldn't hold my breath. And beyond that, there's also the issue, well, there are two other issues. How many people can gather in, you know, a confined space? And thirdly, we've seen over the past 6 months is companies understand very well now that there are a lot of meetings that would have once happened face-to-face that can happen via different technology platforms at a much cheaper cost of business. So whether or not companies are going to be as keen to allow their people to, you know, fly around the country, book hotel rooms, stay overnight. That, let's wait and see. But I think it's going to take some time before that kind of behaviour, revert to where it was before COVID. So we're talking to the Melbourne Convention Centre about a number of things. We've been supporting it financially because we recognise that that convention centre is an absolutely fundamental part of Melbourne's events offering, and not just for events that come in from interstate and overseas, but local events. They're working really hard on different usages for their space, different revenue opportunities. So, in the absence of big-scale business events, there are still, whether it's exhibitions, local business events, putting the facility to other purposes, there's lots that can be done. But again, it's dependent on health advice and what's able to be done. There's also, the need for the government to continue to support the business events industry through the Business Events Fund and to ensure that we're able to compete for those events that are still able to proceed, bearing in mind that a lot of these events are locked in some years in advance. So, convention centres around the world, not just around Australia but around our region, are now competing for events that might take place in 23, 24 or 25. So you'll see in our budget that there'll be no let up in our support for that. Melbourne Convention Bureau does a wonderful job, and even if we can't be holding large-scale business events in 21, it doesn't mean that'll be the case in 22 and beyond, and we'll still be in there pitching for those events.
Great, terrific news. Just moving to regional for a minute. One of the issues I think obviously for Victoria is that it hasn't had the benefit of the sort of intrastate travel that's been happening in other states, thus leading to a more difficult situation for so many operators. I mean, what do you see as the kind of best way of supporting or ensuring that quality of content doesn't disappear as more and more and more of those companies fail? And a sort of second part of that question, in some states, they've been using this as an opportunity to upgrade infrastructure in different parts of the state, tourism related or national park related. Realise the budget's a little way off, but interested in your thoughts on those two aspects from a regional perspective.
Oh yeah, look, I think there's been a lot of really good initiatives that have happened around the country, and I do have to say, watch this space, Margy. But I'll make a few points about it. We've got to recognise that in regional Victoria there is to some extent a disconnect in ambition between the sector and the rest of the regional communities that the sector operates in. So whereas the regional tourism sector might be busting for Melburnians to get out to the regions, if you go and talk to ordinary people in those communities where they've now got a degree of freedom that is possible because they're COVID-free, they're not quite so keen for people from a COVID zone to be heading to their communities. So, and I think the regional tourism operators understand that, but we've got to find that balance between the needs of operators and those regional communities who are really jealously protecting their COVID-free status. We've got in all of regional Victoria, I haven't seen today's numbers, but I think there are 2 active cases in all of regional Victoria. So as a consequence of that, they've had some freedoms for a period of time now. Their restaurants are open, their retail's open with limits, but those limits were just increased last week from 20 indoors to 40 indoors and 70 outdoors. So there's a bit of economic activity now happening and region to region travel, which is possible as a consequence of their COVID-free status. We want to remove that Melbourne regional barrier as quickly as humanly possible. I don't expect that will take too long. The other thing, of course, is that whilst regional Victoria is COVID-free, South Australia and New South Wales have become much more relaxed about letting border communities cross the border. So that's another very important thing that we need to preserve. Once we get to the point where Melburnians are free to travel to the regions, there's a lot of things we can do. We've taken very keen note of the voucher scheme that's been happening in other places. We've already invested substantially in, we've made some substantial announcements in regional tourism infrastructure, and I would hazard to say that there may well be more to come in that space. And then, of course, there's the marketing campaign that Visit Victoria is has sitting there ready to press go on the minute it's appropriate to do so. So, yep, it's been incredibly tough for regional tourism operators. Just over the last few days, we did announce some changes to relax third step restrictions for tour vehicles in regional Victoria, which Felicia and Matt and the team at VTIC have been raising with me. So open air vehicles and enclosed vehicles are now able to be used, which they weren't before the weekend. So that's a little change, I recognise. And as I say, we were also in the business of reimbursing accommodation providers for lost bookings when we went back into the second lockdown. So there's a huge amount coming, and I will just have to encourage everyone to keep their eye on the budget.
Got it. Just while we're talking about money, government money in particular, JobKeeper. It's been a lifeline for so many parts of the industry. Would you like to see it continued after March?
Well, I think any state and territory government would say to the Commonwealth, JobKeeper has been an absolute, like it's been absolutely essential to keeping people employed. And I think the Commonwealth should be, I think it's important that you don't create false economies. And I understand that the Commonwealth might see a budget saving in winding JobKeeper back, but on the other hand, the economic consequences of that might just force the government to expend transfer payments in another way. And so I think whilst the economic recovery is tenuous, I think there's a strong case for the government considering, if not JobKeeper in its current form, some ongoing support for business to keep their people employed.
I'd agree with that. Just one other question about, I suppose, Melbourne and what's always been, I think, seen as a unique part of the Victorian offering is around the performing arts, the creative industries. And, Melbourne is the home of Harry Potter and many other wonderful productions as well. And I know, once again, there's budget coming. But I'm curious to know from your point of view too, one of the issues that we're starting to see in other states is, even though things are loosening up from a cultural perspective, one of the big problems for the cultural community is losing their back of house staff. Being able to retain those skills that actually mean when you can open up again, you've got the people who can make it happen. And they're a bit of an invisible hemorrhage from the cultural industries. Just curious about, your thoughts on support for that part of the community, because it's the one thing that guarantees revisitation to major capital cities is a great arts calendar.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we've been supporting our cultural institutions. I would say to you that the problem of loss of staff is not confined to the arts community either. I mean, the hospitality sector would say that they have a very mobile workforce, and it's been very hard to retain them, particularly in an environment where huge numbers of them are actually not eligible for JobKeeper. So that's been quite difficult. The other ongoing problem for say live theatre, and I've met with the sector in the last couple of weeks, is unlike say AFL or tennis, where a huge amount of the revenue is earned by, whether it's by sponsorship or TV rights, for the live theatre sector, the revenue is almost entirely consequent on gate, on people buying tickets and sitting in venues, and they can't make it profitable with a quarter of the theatre full. So it is extremely challenging in a COVID environment, because all of our public health experts would say, large numbers of people closely packed indoors is about the most dangerous sort of combination. So look, we're working very closely with the live theatre sector, but there are some unique challenges. In larger settings like the National Gallery, the museum, the convention centre, I think the challenges are not quite as acute. But for live theatre and live music, where it's reliant on, people being rather densely packed in enclosed spaces, it's very, very difficult.
Okay, well, Minister, I'm conscious of the time, and I'm equally conscious what an enormous job you have with so many portfolios that are directly affected by this exercise. We really are very grateful for your time this morning. Thank you very, very much for joining us, and we'll be looking forward to that budget.
Thanks, Margy. Good on you.